All right, I might be done with artificial intelligence, but the work is not over. So, as you guys probably know by now, or you will know soon, I've got a lot of big projects in the works, including a book and partnerships and all kinds of other fun stuff. So, let's kick off this new leg of my mission with attractor states so that you kind of understand the framing of everything that I'm going to be working on from here on out, or at least until this segment of the work is done. So, why are we headed for dystopia, and how do we get off of that track? First, you need to understand what an attractor state is. An attractor state is defined quite simply as they are stable configurations or patterns that complex systems naturally evolve toward and tend to maintain once reached, even when subjugated to small perturbations. That's a really fancy way of saying that once you get to a certain state, you tend to stay in that state. So if you've ever had an aquarium, for instance, like I grew up with aquariums, sometimes the aquarium gets infected and everything dies, and that's a bad attractor state. That is the everything goes extinct attractor state. Another attractor state that aquariums have is sometimes they get overgrown with algae. And so what you really want is you want to stay in that nice, happy attractor state where the water is clear, there's lots of biodiversity, and everything is alive rather than either overgrown or dead. So that's just a very, very simple kind of visual metaphor for what an attractor state is on a very small scale. Now, if you scale that up, a nation is like a big terrarium, or the entire planet is like a big terrarium. So, moving on. Civilizations also have attractor states and trajectories. So, one thing that you need to know is that there are basically 5 primary forces. There's plenty of other forces, but in painting in broad swaths, there are 5 primary things that really determine the trajectory of a civilization. And so number 1 is geography. Geography is destiny. So you look at riverways, you look at oceans, you look at arable land. The rest is basically immaterial in compared to that. If you live in a desert region, I'm sorry, but you're just not going to have a powerful empire. When you look at the most powerful empires throughout history, such as China, one of the primary things that they had is a lot of arable land. That is one of the reasons that America is doing so well, is because we have 2 gigantic oceans, tons of riverways, and lots of arable land. Geography is destiny. Next is climate. So stable weather patterns over long periods of time, this is another thing that allows you to have a civilization. If you don't have stable climate, then you don't have a civilization, because if you're going through cycles of long periods of drought versus lots of rain or storms or wind or whatever, then you're going to really struggle. And if it's too hot, too cold, too dry, too wet, etc., you get the idea. Next up is technology. So one thing that has changed as kind of a more or less stable trajectory over particularly the last few hundred to few thousand years of human civilization is that technology has been steadily improving. Now, it's not universal, it's not uniform, but it is generally linear in that we don't usually uninvent technologies, although I will say sometimes we lose technologies. So, for instance, ancient Rome and ancient China invented some technologies that were lost, ancient Egypt as well. Some of those technologies were lost, but today, with the power of the internet and books and universities, pretty much no technology is ever lost today. Sometimes it's suppressed, but that's a little bit different. Next up is institutions. So institutions include the religious institutions, the state institutions, and all of those other things. And that can include religion, universities, and so on and so forth, because the civilization has to be coordinated and organized by those institutions. And again, we have lost institutions in the past, but today our institutions are very robust and broadly distributed. So for instance, if one university goes under, that doesn't mean that the entire university system collapses. Likewise, even if one government is unstable, it can generally be rebuilt with the help of outsiders. As a global community, we tend to band together to help stabilize things. And I know that some people are not big fans of the IMF and the World Bank, but that is one of the functions that they serve today. Now, we will get to how do you get away from that model. And then finally, cultural capital. So this includes shared values, shared beliefs, and most importantly, shared narratives. So for instance, here in the West, we have shared narratives around the rule of law and the power of democracy. Those shared narratives and the fact that you can say them in just a few words actually serves as a very, very powerful coordination mechanism that basically says, well, I live in a democracy and I believe in democracy, and that is a shorthand for a whole lot of these other institutions that create a stable civilization. Now, let's talk about an example of a civilization that expanded, rose, stabilized, and then collapsed. And that is Rome. Now, what I will say is this is a vast oversimplification of the history of Rome, but it went through a period of expansion and then a period of stability and then decline. So what happened? And this is all to tie it back is to understand attractor states. So basically, Rome's fate was sealed from the outset due to those factors. So number one, geography. The Roman Empire was hemmed in by the Sahara to the south, oceans to the west, frozen polar regions to the north, and then also a combination of deserts and tundra to the east. So basically, Rome expanded as much as Rome could expand, given their paradigm, the fact that they came from fertile Europe and they didn't really know how to adapt beyond that. Alexander the Great was able to go a little bit further, but those Middle Eastern deserts really, really hemmed in the Roman Empire. So their original trajectory, their original attractor state was they were just going to get bigger. Why? Because they were good at military and other reasons that we'll talk about in just a second. Number two, Europe. Stable climate, lots of arable land, lots of food. You need lots of food and arable land to support an empire. That's just all there is to it. Number three is technology. Rome was really good at borrowing technology from other people. They weren't necessarily good at inventing themselves. They didn't have good institutions around the sciences. That's not to say that they didn't have sciences, but their sciences paled in comparison to others. But they were really good at just saying, hey, that's a good ship. Why don't we just copy that? So they were compulsive copycats. And so they acquired the recipes for like good concrete, so Roman concrete, aqueducts, ships, their military technology. They did innovate on occasion, but they were not habitual innovators. Still, at the same time, their roads, which were the most sophisticated highway system for literally centuries, that was still not enough to provide coordination, namely via communication. So it was still very, very slow and expensive to move people, goods, and information across the empire. So it was actually kind of remarkable that Rome got as big as it did. They needed the roads, but even still, that wasn't enough to compensate for those coordination problems. And then finally, culture. Roman culture was very, very imperialistic. From the very early days when they were just one little tribe on the Tiber, and they were at war with the Tuscans, and then they were at war with everyone else. They just got really good at war, and so that was just so deeply baked into their culture. They were kind of like, and again, this is a vast oversimplification, they were kind of like the Klingons from Star Trek, which is just like, they're looking for a good fight, they're all about expansion and conquest. And again, I know that is a caricature of the Roman culture, but it's not on accident that that the Roman Empire was highly expansionist. So once they reached those terminal conditions, there was nowhere to go except to eat themselves from inside out. So that internal rot. Now, let's talk about planetary attractor states and those trajectories that we're on. So now that we are globally interconnected with communication networks, the internet, I can communicate instantly with people all over the planet. No Roman Empire or emperor, no matter how rich they were, had that ability. So technology gives us fundamentally new capabilities, and that also includes international commerce, international communication, and so on and so forth. So now, because of the scale of technology and the amount of humans on the planet and everything else, it's more important to look at civilizational attractor states on a planetary scale. So there are 5-ish kind of main attractor states that we can look at. So number one is human extinction. So human extinction is a stable attractor state where basically everyone is dead forever. Yay, end of story. It's not really that interesting to talk about. I know there's still a lot of people that are afraid of this attractor state, but I really see us moving away from that attractor state. And also, I'll show you in just a second, you people in the audience kind of moved away from this as well, so we don't really need to spend that much time about it. Next is civilizational collapse. So this is a potential outcome that would most likely be driven by things like the release, whether intentional or accidental, of bioweapons. So imagine that we had a COVID-19 pandemic, but it was as virulent and lethal as like Ebola and anthrax combined. So you've probably played, what is it, Pandemic Inc. or whatever. So that's one possible way to get to civilizational collapse. Another is just environmental decay. Again, like I said, if you lose your arable land, if you can't grow food, people die. That's as simple as it is. Now, I personally am not as afraid of that due to like climate change and that sort of thing. When you look at the grand like history of the Earth, for most of Earth's history, it has been much warmer than it is now. Now, that's not to, I'm not going to deny that climate change is happening. I'm not denying that humans are causing it. I'm just saying that life on Earth was fine when it was much warmer. So just, that's just, I'm going to plant that stake. So what the data shows, and by data, I mean surveys that I run against you people in my audience, is that we're most likely heading towards a cyberpunk dystopia. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of this video unpacking. So what does that mean? This is where technology serves centralized powers. This means so the key thing, or the aesthetic of cyberpunk is high tech, low life. That's kind of the aesthetic of what that cyberpunk dystopia looks and feels like. But what it is primarily caused by is centralization of power due to technology and economic patterns and so on and so forth. Another attractor state is the solarpunk utopia. So solarpunk utopia, is characterized by decentralized, sustainable technology without strong, coherent culture. So it's a slightly more libertarian or anarchic state that is, again, enabled by technology. And then the final attractor state is fully automated luxury space communism, which is more like Star Trek, where you do have a stable planetary government, but it is also a very fair society and includes post-scarcity economics. So those are kind of the 5 overarching attractor states that I'm currently paying attention to. There's plenty of other potential attractor states, but these are the 5 that I believe are most likely in the grand scheme of things. And right now it seems like we're really on track for cyberpunk dystopia. So moving on, here's the data that I was referring to. So interestingly enough, YouTube now allows you to only do 4 options. I don't know why they changed that. I hope that YouTube brings back 5 options. Like, it seems like a completely arbitrary decision on their part. So anyways, only 5% of you in the audience are afraid of human extinction. 20% are afraid of civilizational collapse, which I thought was a little bit interesting. I thought that it would be lower. So it's still non-trivial. Cyberpunk dystopia far and away the largest at 46%. And then solarpunk utopia, or fully automated luxury space communism. I like your optimism, and I think we can get there. So 30%. So let's see if over the course of the next year or two with the work that I'm doing, if we can get this closer to 40, 50, 60, 70% in terms of faith that we're heading in the right direction. So let's talk about what gets us onto these undesirable attractor states. There we go. That's a mouthful. So what are some of the primary factors that could lead to some of those undesirable attractor states? So number 1, planetary sustainability. Like, whether or not you believe in climate change, I think everyone believes in sustainability. Like, if you have a forest, don't burn the forest down, because then you can't use it anymore. If you have arable land, don't make the land unfarmable. If you have fisheries in the ocean, don't deplete the fisheries. Like, anyone who's played a strategy game is like, hey, if you harvest all your Tiberium and the Tiberium is gone, your army dies and you lose. That's a Command and Conquer reference, by the way. I'm that old. I played the original Command and Conquer. Okay, so anyways, that's one of the key things. Again, I think there's pretty strong agreement that whatever is going on, we need to have sustainability. Next up is technology. So technology is a double-edged sword, or dual use. So one kind of universal principle is that all technology is always dual use, meaning that it can be used for good, it can be used for bad, whatever. Technology itself is neutral, but it's how humans use it and how it can be exploited and how it can be weaponized, and I don't mean weaponized necessarily in the military sense. Social media and internet, for instance, can be weaponized by corporations and governments for thought control and manipulation and surveillance. So there's many ways that technology can always be weaponized or exploited or misused. Next up is institutions. So right now, we have the lowest trust in our institutions than we have ever had in American history. We have the lowest trust in the Supreme Court, the lowest trust in the office of the president, the lowest trust in Congress, and so on and so forth. There is a reason that we have low trust in those institutions, and that is because the current socioeconomic and sociopolitical theories and paradigms are failing. So while GDP is going up, economic and political despair is still also going up. So politicians, based on their current theories, are very confused. They're like, why are people so angry? The economy is good. And it's like, well, that's not the point. We're still angry. We're still depressed. We're still not getting ours. Meanwhile, the rich are getting richer. The powerful are getting more powerful, and so on and so forth. Next up, competitive dynamics. So because we're still a divided world where we have multiple corporations and multiple nations all competing, you basically end up with tragedy of the commons and market externalities and runaway race conditions and those sorts of things. Basically, lots of perverse incentives where winning the game is more important than making sure that the board doesn't get nuked. That's kind of what we're talking about in terms of, and it's not, and I don't mean nuking the board just in terms of planetary sustainability. Nuking the board can have any kinds of causes, such as civil war, world war, runaway AI, although I'm not really afraid of that one. We are our own worst enemies. We don't need artificial intelligence to be our own worst enemies. Scooby-Doo taught us that. That's the Scooby-Doo principle, which is the monster is always a human. My wife has a joke that we need to make a new meme where it's like, when they pull the mask off and it's like Sam Altman. So Sam Altman is the monster, right? Anyways, that's a inside joke. Next is social cohesion and cultural evolution. So social cohesion, which we'll talk a little bit more about in just a second, is basically the fact that everything is very tribal and fragmented and so on and so forth. My position is a little bit different from most people's, and that is one, that tribalism is natural, healthy, and good, and that also the rise of the internet and internet saturation was inevitably going to lead to the realization that there were many fractures in society. And it's part of a natural process of coming together, because what time in human history could someone like me, just an ordinary guy, make videos and get millions and millions of views around the world? Of course, we're going to have collisions of values. We're going to have collisions of beliefs. We're going to have collisions of cultural and religious and political ideologies. That's all part of the process. Now, what this technology will inevitably do is cause cultural evolution, because cultural exchange causes cultural evolution, and the number one way of doing that is communication. This is why I say that communication is far and away the most valuable skill set that you can have today, tomorrow, and forever, particularly not just for your own economic future, but for the future of all humanity. Communication is the number one skill. Moving on. Why social cohesion is critical. So if you have everything else, if you've got geography on your side, you've got climate on your side, you've got technology on your side, even if you have institutions on your side, even if the government is correct, and your education systems are correct, and by correct I mean like optimized or whatever, you know what I mean. If you don't have social cohesion, people will still be bashing each other over the head. And so the reason that I've picked a photo of Martin Luther King Jr. here is because what he helped do was create social cohesion around a specific value, which was civil rights. So what we're trying to do now is not create a new civil rights movement. We're trying to create a new kind of movement, a grassroots movement around creating more social cohesion with the use of specific narratives. Now, without that social cohesion, you end up with all of these other problems. Coordination challenges. If people can't agree, and as you all pointed out over the last couple of years, we can't even align humanity, and even many people are not aligned with themselves. So aligning humanity through coordination, through communication and narratives, that is the number one way. Whether you're looking at historical examples from Mahatma Gandhi, from Martin Luther King Jr., whoever, right? There have always been people that help coordinate narratives, and that is part of the movement that I am trying to make and join. Rising tribalism, as I said, tribalism is a natural and healthy thing, but as with any phenomenon, it can also go sideways. I'm not saying that it is always 100% good, because tribalism can also lead to division and those sorts of things. Information warfare. So information warfare, either intended or otherwise, because again, some of what we're seeing in terms of cultural division is just a natural consequence of the internet. And I think that a lot of it could work itself out over time, but that doesn't mean that we can't help it along with, for instance, better algorithms, better policies on social media platforms, and those sorts of things. Cultural divergence, the American way of life, the Chinese way of life, France and Germany and Russia, we all have, and that's just the global north, by the way. That's completely not even paying attention to all of Africa and South America. We all have very, very different ways of looking at the world, but over time, as we develop new cultural and social philosophies, namely metamodernism is on the rise, which includes the entire planet. So we need shared narratives that allow us to overcome that cultural divergence while respecting cultural differences, because culture is good, with a tiny asterisk. It's not relevant to this conversation. At the same time, we also need global narratives. We need globally shared narratives, which that is what the internet will help us do. That is, we have solved the communication problem. Now we need to learn how to use it. And all of these things are interconnected. So social cohesion is critical, and you do that with shared narratives. That is how you solve the coordination failures that other people like Daniel Schmachtenberger have talked about. Divide and conquer. Divide and conquer is a time-honored tradition for any kind of warfare, whether it is, Russia versus America, whether it is, Rome versus the Gauls, whatever. Divide and conquer has always been used, but it is specifically being used on the information level today. So everything from social media manipulation, which, by the way, it's not just the government, it's also the owners of those platforms, the wealthy elite, the bourgeois, the billionaires like Elon Musk and everyone else. So social media manipulation, that allows the powers that be, the establishment, to amp up using bots, algorithms, whatever, to really keep us divided. This level of centralized information control as well. You might be thinking about the mainstream media, although, as platforms like YouTube and TikTok and others, we get more hours of view time than CNN and Fox. So, but that, I think you know what I mean. There's many, many avenues to deliver information, but at the same time, we're all still mediated by the big networks, by Google and TikTok and corporations and that sort of stuff. We don't have a decentralized way to communicate with each other that is not mediated either by a corporation or a government. That is a problem, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Economic scapegoating. Blaming immigrants and blaming foreigners and blaming whoever, that is all smoke and mirrors. That is political theater that is meant to redirect your attention from who actually is the problem, which is the powers that be or the establishment, and so on and so forth. I think you get the idea. We can move on. Dystopia is the default trajectory. Why? So number one, capitalism. Now, a lot of you will say capitalism is good. And I know there's a lot of people, and believe me, I have a love-hate relationship with capitalism as well. Because again, capitalism is just the observation that capital is valuable. Asset classes have changed over time. For most of civilization's history, the most valuable asset class was land, arable land. If you remember from the Monty Python movie, she's got huge tracts of land, right? That's how you measured wealth for the vast majority of human civilization's history, which is how valuable is your land and how much do you have of it. But then with the Industrial Revolutions, a new asset class became extremely valuable, and that was factories. That was the steel mills. That was the textile mills. Those were the shipwrights. These were the places that built the new things that were actually more valuable than the land. It was the tractors. It was the boats. It was the little widgets. It was the candle factories. So that was for the last 200-ish years that factories slowly became the most valuable asset class. If you look at around the turn of the century, so around 1900, who were the wealthiest people? The steel barons, the oil barons, and the rail barons. Why? Because that was the peak of the Industrial Revolution, and so entirely different asset classes became the most valuable thing. Now what happens when you look at the most valuable asset classes today? It's tech companies. It's the Googles, the Microsofts, the FANGs, although they've all changed names now, Netflix, Meta, and so on and so forth. These are the most valuable companies because, again, capitalism is just the principle of whoever owns the means of production is the wealthiest, and the means of production has evolved over time. So again, that's just an observation of how things work, but capitalism is a theory that says this is necessary and good, and we should support this as much as possible. So now we're heading towards late-stage capitalism. Next is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism in particular shifts, it's a socio-political and socio-economic theory that says actually we should put power in the hands of corporations because corporations are the most valuable asset class today, and therefore we need to give them more economic agency than workers and voters. And that is why wage stagnation has happened since the 1980s. And this is also why politicians are confused, is because whether you're Democrat or Republican, all politicians today believe in neoliberalism. There's just some slight differences in the implementation, or slight flavor differences, like you have some neoconservatism, but by and large, all politicians, particularly in America, all still believe in neoliberalism, which basically says whatever else is true, the state needs to be powerful, and also so do governments. Not governments. Corporations also need to be powerful. And I know that neoliberalism technically says small government, but that has never panned out. So then what does that lead to? That leads to corporate hegemony. So corporate hegemony basically says, okay, because we're increasing the economic agency of corporations at the expense of real human beings, that means that they end up with more influence on culture, on policy, on the information landscapes, and everything. So they can shape what you see, what you hear. They can shape how you vote. And also there's a revolving door relationship between business and government. Those are the three legs of civilization today: business, government, and the rest of us. And guess what? The current policy is between capitalism and neoliberalism. It says, the rest of you voters, your part to play is only you are the little workers. We don't care about unions. We don't really care about your votes, so we create a representative democracy, which then creates senators and congresspeople and presidents who are more beholden to the corporations, and this is all by design. Next is the corporate conglomerates. So you look at the gigantic multinational conglomerates that are actually in many cases more powerful than the nations that they operate in. This is an inevitable result of these policies, and it just makes economic sense. The bigger your corporation is, the bigger your reach, the more you can twist those knobs and actually change the rules of the game to favor you. This is with things like regulatory capture that we've all been talking about with artificial intelligence. Now, this creates a vicious cycle because the more that power gets concentrated at the top, the more power they have and the more power they can exert to change the rules in their favor. This is why this single slide tells you why dystopia is the current default trajectory. It is because power is concentrated at the top and there is very little we can do to change that. Now, I've got some really good news, and that is decentralization is the antidote. The number one symptom of what is going wrong today is centralization of power or concentration of power. Now, this is not the first time civilization has gone through this. The Roman emperors, concentration of power at the top, them and their wealthy friends. Guess what? The system came to an end. Next up, monarchies. It ended spectacularly in Russia and France with the end of monarchies, where they said, okay, we're tired of this system, let's change stuff. So centralization is the problem. Decentralization, therefore, is the answer. This, in all the conversations I've had with economists, theorists, mathematicians, everyone else, it all comes back to decentralization. So how do you implement decentralization? There are actually a few ways that you can pursue decentralization. Number one is economic decentralization. Any policies that reduce the gradient between the concentration of the wealthy and the poor, anything that smooths that curve out or levels the playing field is going to benefit us. So that can be anything from higher taxes on the wealthy and corporations. This can be wealth redistribution policies. And I don't mean just like socialism. That's not what I'm talking about. What I mean is not tax and spend. Well, tax and spend on services, yes. But also redistribution policies like universal basic income, particularly if UBI is funded explicitly by taking money from where it is most concentrated, such as in big tech, billionaires, and so on and so forth. anytime you see concentration of wealth and power, should be a target for where you say, okay, that's where it is centralized, that's where it's concentrated. Let's decentralize and distribute economically. Next up is political decentralization. So right now, a team of just a few hundred people in Congress make decisions that affect millions. Consider this, particularly here in America. When America was founded, it had a fraction of the population that it does today. But you still have just a few hundred people that are making decisions that affect an entire nation. That is way too much concentration of power and influence. That means that we probably ultimately need to radically restructure the way that representative democracy functions, or restructure the entire system. So there are policies or theories such as subsidiarity, which basically says decentralize political authority as much as possible so that every decision is made at the lowest possible level that it can be made. So that means empowering cities more, that means empowering states more, and that means distributing power from nations. Now, one problem with this, though, is that if we did that, then that means that relatively speaking, the corporations have even more power than our governments. So another thing is taking power away from corporations. We need to undermine corporate hegemony and corporate power, and we'll talk about how we can do that in just a minute. Next up is technological decentralization. This includes promoting more open source, revising copyright and IP laws so that we can weaken corporate control over the means of production. That's really what it comes down to, is that if Microsoft and Google and everyone else, if they say, well, we invented an AI and it benefits everyone, well, but we get to profit from it. And by the way, we can continue profiting from it forever and continue concentrating our own wealth and power. Next up, and finally, is information decentralization. So this is protecting encryption laws, privacy laws, protecting net neutrality, attacking or resisting surveillance, attacking surveillance legislation, and demanding transparency at all levels. That means corporate transparency, government transparency, and so on and so forth, not just algorithms. That is, demanding transparency at all levels is one way that you can decentralize information. So, with all that being said, on practical terms, technology will be a large part of the solution. It's not the only part of the solution. Like I said, we need social cohesion and narratives, but that's why we're having these conversations on the internet. So, technologies that can help. Number one is blockchain. Blockchain can allow true decentralized or collective ownership through tamper-proof, transparent accounting and records keeping, which basically means that you can decentralize ownership of something with or without the help of the government. So that means individuals, whether it's individual corporations or municipalities, can say, hey, we can manage these resources without the government's help. Next up is cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is huge, and the reason that nations are so hostile to cryptocurrency is because it directly takes power away from their reserve banks, their central banks, and says, you know what, we actually don't need you at all. And that is actually existentially terrifying to neoliberal states. So cryptocurrency is one of the biggest things that we can do to decentralize economic power. Next up is artificial intelligence. AI is already democratizing access to information and cognitive labor. Most of us have access to free AI tools, and the paid AI tools are relatively cheap. Now, we can take that one step further by doing more on the open source level. And so some people will say, but AI is existentially a threat to humanity, so we need to lock it behind closed doors. Guess what? Guess whose hands that plays directly into? The doomer narrative that says AI is dangerous and AI needs to be shut down and AI needs to be controlled, that plays directly into the capitalist and neoliberal establishment narrative that says, yes, only we can save you. We're the ones that are going to manage everything. So yes, regulatory capture and IP laws and keeping everything closed. That policy leads directly to dystopia. So next up is, of course, open source in general, not just of artificial intelligence, but implementing open source whenever and wherever as much as possible, particularly as data and AI become the most valuable asset class. Because like I said, we went from the asset class of land being the most valuable, to factories being the most valuable, to now technology is the most valuable asset class. And what's next is far and away artificial intelligence and robots. So open source robots, open source AI models, open source data sets. Those will be the way that we can decentralize economic power and all kinds of other power in the future. And next up is decentralized autonomous organizations, which is basically a way to increasingly decentralize and distribute governance or political power, basically saying, you know what, we actually don't need a few corrupt politicians. We can self-organize at a local level, but also at a societal level. This is what the promise of these technologies are, and this is why we need to invest in them. So, how can we all help? On practical terms, here are 5 things that literally everyone here can do at some level. So number 1, learn. If you learn about these technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, cryptocurrency, blockchain, DAOs, whatever, open source, the more you know, the more you can help other people learn. So learn and teach. Number 2 is invest. If you are an investor, and this, by the way, this is not financial advice, this is not a request for investment, but I'm just saying if you have the ability and willpower to support any of these startups, any of these technologies that are moving in a more ethical, decentralized direction, consider investing in them because where money goes, results follow. Number 3 is vote. There are politicians who are in favor of cryptocurrency, of blockchain, and DAOs. Find and support those politicians and those policies that support that direction. Now, it's not going to be like a rip and replace. We're not going to burn everything down and start over. We will have to get there through incremental changes. And that means that there will be politicians, more forward-thinking politicians. And I say forward-thinking because it's not Democrat or Republican. There are plenty of conservatives out there, whether they're politicians or people in my audience who are like, yeah, let's be a little bit more libertarian about this. Let's be a little bit more anarchist about this. And there are also progressives who are like, you know what? There's too much concentration of power. So you know what? We can meet in the middle and agree on that, even if we don't agree on other things. Number 4 is deploy these technologies. If you run a business, if you're in a business, if you're a business leader, or even if you're just an individual, use these technologies as much as possible. That includes blockchain, cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, open source technologies, and so on and so forth. Next up is research. If you want to get into the research field, whether you're researching these technologies directly in terms of first principles, or you're researching how to integrate them into society, all of the above is helpful. And by the way, you don't need to have a PhD to do research. Lots of people in my communities do this kind of research and share it all the time. So much research is shared, there we go, on Discord. There are plenty of communities out there, including some of my own, where this kind of stuff is shared, whether it is work that we're doing, such as on the Raspberry project, which, by the way, is continuing. So that is an example of decentralized, renegade open source AI research. Anyone can do it, I promise. So if any of these resonates with you, jump in. Here's what I'm doing to help. Number 1, educating the masses. This is why I built my YouTube platform, which is because the mission remains the same, which is I want that Star Trek utopian future. That is the goal. That has always been the goal. I'm moving on from AI because AI is only one small piece of the puzzle. It's an important piece of the puzzle, and it's going to be a crucial catalyzing event, but it's not the only bit. Number 2 is clarifying narratives. Explaining these things to you in simple, clear terms so that you can repeat them. Because again, narratives are how societies coordinate. Shared narratives like the civil rights movement, that is an example of a coordinating movement where a single, easy to repeat, clear narrative such as decentralization is the way forward. That is what we can do. Number 3 is I'm writing books. I'm working on a couple more books. I just published my first novel. I've got another novel in the works and so on and so forth. Books are a really great way to encapsulate all of this in one go and share it all. And I'm also talking to a bunch of experts. As I mentioned, I'm interviewing a bunch of people for these books, and I'm building a team. The announcements are forthcoming, or by the time you see this, the announcements might have been made. Anyways, we're building a team to really kick this grassroots movement off into high gear. So finally, consider supporting me. I have a Patreon, so if you want to jump in on my Discord, you can jump in on Patreon. It's only $5 a month. I also have a Substack. You're welcome to either just subscribe to my Substack, or you can support me through Substack if you don't like Patreon. Next up is school. So I have a new community called the New Era Pathfinders. And the entire purpose of this community is how do we find our way to that utopian future? That is the point of this community is how do we find our way to utopia on an individual level? And how do we find our way to utopia on a collective level? That is the point of this community. So if you support me there, you can jump in and help out. Number 4 is on X. At the time of recording, my monetization on X is coming through. So if you want to subscribe on X, if you like that platform, I'm there. You can also become a channel member here on YouTube. And finally, you could buy my book. It's very entertaining, and I put a lot of effort into it, and it really looks at a lot of these narratives and how artificial intelligence can, and other narratives, can shape and reshape civilizations. And finally, if you want to become a writer as well, my wife and I just launched a new community called Literary Launchpad. This is for sci-fi and fantasy and speculative fiction authors. So, with all that being said, consider jumping in, supporting me any way that you want or can, like and subscribe and so on and so forth. And the end. Thank you for watching. Cheers.